She had chosen the left shoulder, not because it was the most visible position on the gown, though it was, and not because the dark green wool set the garnets off to a particular advantage, though it did. She had chosen the left shoulder because when she stood in the doorway of the dining room, which she intended to do for exactly 3 seconds before entering, anyone at the table who recognized the brooch would have to look at her face to see it. They could not glance at a hand or a wrist and look away. They would have to meet her eyes. Miss Cecily Vane stood in the corridor outside the dining room of Dunmore House on the 14th day of November, in the year 1812, and she breathed once slowly, and pinned the smile she did not feel to her composure, the way one pins a hem. Functional. Invisible. Holding everything together. The brooch was cold against her shoulder. It had been cold since she fastened it an hour ago, and it had not warmed to her body, as though it knew it did not belong there. Inside the room she could hear the murmur of assembled guests. Lady Dunmore, the dowager, would be seated at her end of the table already, back straight as a column, fan deployed at the appropriate height. Lord Featherstone, who laughed too loudly at his own remarks, would be 3 seats to her left, the Honourable Miss Cavendish and her mother. The solicitor, Mr. Potts, invited for his connections to the northern land disputes, and seated near the foot, where his rank permitted. And Lady Priscilla Harwick, who had arrived 2 days ago with a trunk of silk evening gowns and an expression of settled ownership, would be seated at the Earl of Dunmore's right hand, because Lady Dunmore had arranged it, and what Lady Dunmore arranged was law in this house. Cecily opened the door. She stood in the frame for 3 seconds, which was precisely long enough. The table turned toward her the way a garden turns toward the sun, not all at once, but in succession, each face tilting, each pair of eyes arriving at the doorway and then traveling, almost involuntarily, to the left shoulder of her dark green gown where the garnet and pearl brooch caught the candlelight and held it. She watched them all. Lord Featherstone blinked and looked away immediately, which told her nothing. Miss Cavendish leaned slightly toward her mother, which told her very little. The solicitor, Mr. Potts, looked at his suit. Lady Dunmore's fan paused at precisely the height it had been deployed, which was interesting. The Earl of Dunmore, seated at the head of the table, had not yet looked at her at all, his eyes on some document that had apparently followed him from the study, which was either genuine distraction or the most practiced performance of indifference she had yet encountered in her 24 years. And Lady Priscilla Harwick, at his right hand, in cream silk and diamond eardrops, looked at Cecily's left shoulder and went very, very still. There it was. Cecily crossed the room to her seat at the foot of the table beside Mr. Potts and unfolded her napkin and waited. She had been a gentleman's daughter before she was a secretary. That sequence mattered. Her father, Mr. Vane of Pemberton in Wiltshire, had kept a respectable household and an immoderate library, and he had educated his only daughter with the same materials he used to educate himself, which was the kind of decision a man makes when he is not paying attention to what the world will require of his daughter when he is gone. He had died 14 months ago, of a quick fever that gave her 3 days' warning and no practical provision. The house had gone to his creditors. The library had been sold. She had gone to work. Her first position had been with the household of Sir Gerald Martin in Bath, where she had lasted 8 months before a diamond and ivory brooch disappeared from Lady Martin's dressing table, and someone thought it would be convenient to mention that the new secretary had been seen near the room. The accusation was never proved because Cecily had not taken it. Unproved accusations in genteel households settle into the furniture like dampness. Everyone can feel them even after the room is aired. She had left Bath with a letter of character that said nothing wrong about her, and therefore said everything. The next position had come through a solicitor's notice, which told her something about the level at which she now stood. The Earl of Dunmore's estate required a secretary, fluent in household accounts, correspondence in 3 hands, and the management of the annual inventory. The previous secretary, a Mr. Hobbs, had suffered an apoplexy in October. The position was for a woman of education and discretion. Cecily was both, and she needed the income. And so she had come to Dunmore House. She had been here 23 days, The house itself had taken some learning. Dunmore was not a small establishment. A main wing of 4 stories, an east wing of 2, a stable block larger than the house she had grown up in. The entry hall was paved in cold gray stone. The corridors were lit generously, with oil lamps rather than candles, though the drawing room still relied on the older light and smelled pleasantly of beeswax. The library held 3,000 volumes by Cecily's count, which he had not meant to perform but had begun one afternoon while organizing the catalogue and could not stop once started. The park beyond the south windows was winter bare, and the stone balustrade of the terrace was gray with frost in the mornings. She had arrived on a Tuesday, in a hired carriage, arranged by the solicitor, with a trunk of moderate size and a small leather satchel containing her father's remaining ledgers, which she had kept, because she could not bear to leave them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, had received her with the careful courtesy extended to persons of uncertain station. Warmly, but with a slight question in the warmth, as though not quite certain which room to put her in. Cecily had answered the question by asking immediately for the household accounts and the location of the East Wing register. The uncertainty had resolved itself. If you find one of those receiving small, gentle nudges at the start, leave a word below. We will be in the dining room for some time, yet. In 23 days, she had learned the name of every servant in the house, their years of service, their ailments, their preferences. She had learned that the East Wing had a damp problem on the 2nd floor, that Mr. Hobbs had noted in his ledger, and left unaddressed. She had learned that the Earl's correspondence was 3 months behind, that his steward, Mr. Graves, was competent but slow, and that the Dowager Lady Dunmore controlled the household social calendar with the precision of a parliamentary timetable. She had learned that the Earl himself was rarely present, rarely warm, and that when he passed through a room, the air in it changed the way air changes before a storm. She had not, in 23 days, exchanged more than 11 words with him. On the 12th day, she had found the brooch. She had been working in the study that afternoon, as she now did most afternoons, because the study housed the household accounts and the correspondence files and the long inventory of the Dunmore estate that needed updating before the quarter day in December. The study was cold. It was always cold. She worked in her coat. She had opened the central desk drawer to retrieve the sealing wax, and beneath a sheaf of correspondence she had not yet filed, she found it. A cluster brooch, dark, garnets and seed pearls on a silver mount, roughly the size of a shilling coin. She had seen it twice. Once, at the Hartley Assembly in September. She had not yet been engaged to Dunmore then, but had gone with the sister of a friend, and noticed the piece because it was old-fashioned in a way she found appealing. And she had seen it on the breast of Lady Harwick, who had worn it to that assembly with a cream walking dress. And once more, 2 days ago, when Lady Harwick arrived at Dunmore with her trunk and her expression of settled ownership, and she had worn it at luncheon, she had not worn it since. And here it was, in the desk drawer where Cecily worked. Beneath papers Cecily was known to handle. She sat with it in her palm for a long time, the study cold around her, the candle guttering on its stand. She had been accused of theft before. She had not done it then, and she had not done it now. And she understood the architecture of what she was looking at with a clarity that did not require her to be anything other than what she was. A woman who read carefully and noticed what the room contained. Lady Harwick had hidden the brooch here. Deliberately. She intended at some point in the coming days to discover it missing, to raise the alarm, and to suggest who might have taken it. The sequence had worked before, or something like it had. It had a rehearsed quality. Cecily sat in the cold study for 11 minutes and made her decision. She could replace the brooch precisely where she had found it and wait for the accusation to come. She would then be required to prove a negative. She had done that once, and she knew what it cost. Or she could wear it to dinner. She pinned it to the left shoulder of her dark green evening gown at 6 o'clock in the small mirror above the washstand in her room, and she looked at herself in the glass with one steady thought. Whoever knows it is here will have to say so in front of the entire table. Let them. Let them explain how they know. She was waiting for someone to flinch, and Lady Harwick had flinched. The dinner moved forward. The soup arrived. Cecily ate it. Lord Featherstone made his remark about the pheasant and laughed. Lady Dunmore expressed an opinion about the roads to Northampton. Mr. Potts talked about the land dispute in a way that was meant to be interesting. And then Lady Harwick spoke. "Miss Vane!" The voice carried the length of the table with the ease of a woman accustomed to rooms larger than this one. "I did not expect to find you joining us. I was invited," Cecily said pleasantly. "The secretary," Lady Harwick said, turning to address the table at large with a small private smile. "How continental of Dunmore House to arrange it!" "Good heavens," said Mrs. Cavendish, not unkindly. "Has the clerk joined us?" Lady Harwick's smile did not change. Her eyes were on Cecily's left shoulder. Cecily ate her soup. She had known the risk of this evening. She had known it when she fastened the brooch, and she had known it when she chose her seat, and she had known it when she opened the dining-room door. What she had not known, what she had not permitted herself to calculate, was whether the Earl would be present, and what he would do. She had learned enough of Charles Ashmore in 23 days to know that he was not a man who could be predicted by rank alone. He was something stranger, something that had not finished deciding what it was. The brooch had not disappeared from his notice. She saw it when she first looked at him across the table. The brief downward track of his gaze to her left shoulder, the pause so short it might have been imagined, and then his eyes elsewhere, as though nothing had registered. His expression, which had been somewhere near neutral before she entered, had shifted 1 degree. She could not name the direction of the shift. She noted it. On the 16th day of her service at Dunmore House, she had been in the study very late. She had not meant to stay past 9 in the evening, but the quarterly inventory was more disordered than she had realized. Mr. Hobbs had kept a system of notation that was intelligible only to Mr. Hobbs. She had lost track of the hour, and, when she looked up, the candle had burned past its halfway point, and the house was quiet. She did not notice immediately that she was not alone. The Earl had come in at some point. She could not have said when. He was standing near the bookshelves on the far side of the room, in the attitude of a man who had intended to retrieve a volume, and had then forgotten the retrieval, his attention arrested by something across the room. By the time she became aware of him, she had been in his sight for some minutes at least, writing in the ledger with the neat, narrow hand that was her most useful professional asset, then pausing to lean back, then returning to the work. She had been speaking, she realized. She had been speaking quietly to Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, who had come in with tea and who had remained to watch the fire for a moment, and Cecily had asked, while refilling her pen, how the old woman's knee was managing in the cold and whether the compress Mrs. Graves had mentioned last week had brought any ease, and whether Dr. Phipps had said anything useful when she had seen him on Thursday. She had not been aware of the Earl standing near the bookshelves while she did this. She was aware of it now. She was making a correction in the East Wing register when she heard the door close. The Earl stood in the doorway. He wore his coat, but no cravat, which was either distraction or grief, and she had learned enough of him by then to understand the difference. He had a document in his hand that he had apparently been intending to consult, and when he saw her at the desk, he stopped, as a man stops when the room contains something he did not account for. "Miss Vane, my lord." She stood immediately as propriety required. "I beg your pardon. I lost track of the hour. Sit down," he said. It came out flat, not unkind. He moved to the window and stood there, looking at the black grounds beyond the glass. "It is nearly midnight. I am aware, my lord, the East Wing register is disordered." "Yes, my lord." A silence. He turned from the window and looked at her, and it was the first time he had really looked at her, she thought. Not the passing glance of a man acknowledging a presence in his house, but the specific attention of a man trying to read something he had not expected to find difficult. "How long will it take?" he said. "Another 3 evenings, if I am not interrupted." The briefest pause. "I will not interrupt you." He was at the door when she said, without entirely intending to, "My lord, the study is very cold." He turned back. "There is no fire laid," she said. He looked at the empty grate. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has not registered the temperature of a room in some time, perhaps in years. Then he crossed to the bell pull and rang for the housemaid, and he stood beside the door until the girl arrived and the fire was lit, and he left without another word. The following morning, she found that a fire had been laid in the study before she arrived. It had been laid every morning since. He had never mentioned it. On the 18th day, she had been in the study when he came in at noon, and he had said, without preamble, "My wife died in the autumn of 1810. He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying too long, and has decided to set down in a neutral location to see what happens to it. There was a carriage accident on the road to Norwich. She survived it by 3 days. I was told she was already gone." A pause. "I was not with her when she died." Cecily said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not wrong. She had learned this in the months since her father died. The wrong thing was almost always a word, and the right thing was almost always the absence of one. She held the pen she had been holding and let him have the silence. He was standing at the window. His reflection in the glass was still the jaw, set in the way she had come to recognize as grief rather than coldness, though from the outside the two looked nearly the same. He had a letter in his hand that he had not yet read, and his thumb moved once across the seal and then stopped. He turned away and began reading the letter in his hand, and the subject was closed, but it was not closed. It was simply set down in the room, and it sat between them for the remainder of the afternoon, with a weight she could feel in her chest. That evening she had opened the side cabinet where the old household correspondence was filed, looking for the records of the Dunmore estate accounts from 1810, and she had found at the back of the lowest drawer, behind a sheaf of outdated lease agreements, a letter. It bore no outer address. It was sealed with plain wax, the seal unbroken. On the front, in a hand, she did not recognize were the words, "From my husband, when he is ready." She had understood at once what it was. She had set it very carefully back in the cabinet, behind the lease agreements where she had found it. She had covered it with the papers. She had returned to the desk and continued working, and not thought about it for the remainder of the evening, which was a lie, she told herself with tremendous discipline. She had thought about nothing else. The question of the letter sat inside her, alongside the question of the brooch, and together they constituted the two most important things she had handled in 23 days, and they pointed in opposite directions. The brooch was a trap designed by a woman of calculated cruelty. The letter was a message from a dead woman to the man who had not been able to say goodbye. The brooch required her to act. The letter required her to wait until she understood what waiting cost him. At the dining table over the fish course, Lady Harwick turned to Lord Featherstone and said something that made him laugh, and her pale eyes drifted back to Cecily's shoulder. Cecily had once heard that the most effective waiting was the kind that looked like patience. She was discovering that this was not exactly true. What effective waiting looked like was work. She had spent 23 days working so thoroughly that she had become, without intending it, indispensable. The East Wing damp problem had been reported in a memorandum to the steward, Mr. Graves, with a proposed schedule of repair and an estimate she had compiled from the accounts of the previous year's roof work. The correspondence was current. The inventory would be finished by quarter day. The servants had someone who knew their names. She was waiting for someone to flinch, and the entire table had watched Lady Harwick go still. Cecily set her spoon against the soup bowl and kept her hands still in her lap, which required more discipline than any account she had reconciled in 23 days. She was aware of the Earl at the head of the table with the particular awareness she had been managing since the 16th night. The awareness of exactly where he was in the room, without looking the way one is aware of a fire in a cold corridor without needing to see the flame. She had not named this to herself. She did not intend to name it. What she had named, with precision, was the fact that in 23 days, he had not once been what she had expected. The letters from the solicitor had described the Earl of Dunmore as cold, as difficult, as a man of irregular hours and exacting standards. He was exacting. The cold she had not found. or rather had found a specific kind that was not what the word usually meant. The cold of a man who has turned his fire inward and forgotten that other people might need warmth from the same source. She acknowledged quietly and entirely to herself, in some difficulty. The roast arrived. Lord Featherstone served himself with enthusiasm. Mr. Potts discussed the northern roads. And then Lady Harwick set down her fork. "I wonder," she said, in the pleasantest possible voice, "where one acquires such an interesting brooch." The table quieted in the particular way of a room that has been waiting for something, and now believes it has arrived. Cecily looked at Lady Harwick steadily. "From a desk drawer," she said. A very brief silence. "I beg your pardon," Lady Harwick said. "I found it," Cecily said. "In the desk drawer of the Dunmore study. On the 12th day of my engagement here, beneath the November correspondence." She paused. "I recognized it immediately. I had admired it at the Hartley Assembly in September. I had also seen it at your throat at luncheon 2 days ago. I was curious how it had come to be in the desk where I work." The room had gone, utterly, completely quiet. Lady Harwick's expression did not change, which was itself an expression. Her eyes moved to the Earl of Dunmore at the head of the table. He had set down his own fork. He was watching Cecily with an attention so complete and so still it felt like a physical pressure across the length of the table. And she met his eyes for a moment, and then looked away, because she had said what she had come to say, and the rest of it was not hers to control. "Miss Vane," Lady Dunmore said, from her end of the table. Her voice had the quality of a woman reaching for the correct register and not quite finding it. "Priscilla," it was the Earl's voice. Quiet, level. The single word stopped the table. Lady Harwick looked at him. "Is this your brooch?" he said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be damning Charles. She stopped. "Is this your brooch?" She lifted her chin. "It has been missing since last Thursday." "Yes," the Earl said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "It has been in the study where it was placed for Miss Vane to be found with." "I cannot imagine what you mean by any of this," she said. "I can imagine it precisely." His voice was still level, still quiet, still entirely without volume, and it was the most controlled fury Cecily had ever witnessed in a man of 36 years. "I have read Mr. Hobbs's notes. I know what was alleged in Bath, and I know who was connected to the Martin household in the months preceding that allegation." This was not something Cecily had known. She felt the table settle beneath her like ground that has shifted. Lady Harwick said nothing. "Miss Vane is my guest," the Earl said to the table, and the word rang in the quiet room, with a weight that was not at all casual. "Lady Harwick is not." The silence that followed had a shape. Cecily could feel the guests feeling it. Lord Featherstone's glass arrested halfway to his mouth, Mrs. Cavendish's eyes very carefully on her plate, Mr. Potts looking at the middle distance with the expression of a solicitor who is memorizing a scene he may be required to attest to later. Lady Harwick rose. She did it well with the composure of a woman who has rehearsed many exits, and she inclined her head and left the room without another word, which was perhaps the cleverest thing she had done all evening. Lady Dunmore set down her fan and looked at her son, and her expression passed through several states that Cecily could not entirely read, settling somewhere near a recognition she had not expected. She said nothing. The Earl looked at Cecily across the length of the table. She held his gaze for a moment, and she thought that if she had been less thoroughly trained in composure, she might have looked away. He was looking at her with an expression that had nothing of social management in it, which was the first time she had seen him look at anyone that way. It was the expression of a man who has resolved something. "Miss Vane," he said. "Perhaps you would do me the honor of remaining after dinner." "Of course, my lord," she said. The meal resumed. Lord Featherstone recovered himself admirably and made a remark about the Northampton roads, and Mrs. Cavendish agreed with him, and Mr. Potts found something to say about the price of wool that carried them through the second remove. The Dowager Lady Dunmore ate her dinner with the steady application of a woman who is recalibrating a considerable quantity of prior assessment, and said very little, which Cecily found, in its own way, more significant than anything she had said all evening. Cecily unfolded her napkin across her lap and took a breath. And she thought about the sealed letter in the cabinet drawer. Tonight, the guest departed to the drawing room at 9:30, and Cecily remained at the table as the footman cleared, and the Earl remained too, standing at the window at the far end of the dining room in the attitude she had come to know. The coat, the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the posture of a man holding something. When the footman had gone, he said, "How did you know it would work?" "I did not know," she said. "I knew that wearing it was the only action that was mine to take. Whatever happened after that was not within my control." He turned from the window and looked at her. The candlelight was very low now, 2 branches remaining, and it cast him in a warmth that the rest of the room did not share. "Mr. Hobbs' notes were not complete," he said, "but they contained enough. He had been making inquiries on my behalf since October. About me, about the Martin household, and about Lady Harwick's connections to it." A pause. "I did not commission the inquiry. He made it because he was thorough. He noted that the allegation had a pattern, and that the pattern had a source, and he was preparing a memorandum when he suffered his apoplexy." A longer pause. "I should have read his notes on the first day." "You had other things to read," she said carefully. He looked at her. She stood. She went to the door, and then she stopped. "My lord," she said, "I need to tell you something before tomorrow." He waited. "On the 18th day," she said, working in the side cabinet, "I found a letter in the lowest drawer behind the lease agreements. It was addressed in a hand I did not recognize. It said, on the front, 'For my husband, when he is ready.'" She looked at the floor for a moment, and then at him. "I replaced it exactly where I found it. I have not touched it since. I tell you now because I think you should know that it exists." He went very still. The stillness was different from the stillness he wore in rooms of social pressure. That stillness was discipline. This was something that had come from elsewhere, from a depth she could not see the bottom of, and it lasted a long time. "Thank you," he said at last. 2 words, in a voice that had lost its careful evenness, and was simply what it was. She nodded once and left the room. She heard him cross the dining room floor, heard his steps in the corridor toward the study, heard the quiet. She went upstairs. She sat in her room without lighting her candle, and listened to the house settle around her, and tried to think about the quarterly inventory, which was a thing she had no success with at all. She was still sitting in the dark when she heard him on the stairs. Much later, and his step was different from the step she had learned. It was slower. It was the step of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for 2 years. She thought of Elaine Ashmore, who had survived 3 days, and had written a letter, and had addressed it to her husband's readiness and not to his name. She thought about what a woman understands, in 3 days, about the man she has chosen. She was, she realized, not afraid of anything that had happened today. She was afraid of tomorrow, which was a much more useful thing to be afraid of. In the morning, the study fire was already lit when she arrived, as it had been every morning since the 16th day. She sat at the desk and opened the inventory and worked for 2 hours in the warmth of it, and then the door opened and Charles Ashmore, Earl of Dunmore, came in. He did not have a document in his hand. He stood just inside the door, and he looked at her, and then he said, "She asked me to forgive myself. She was very specific about it." A pause. Elaine was always specific. "That sounds like someone worth knowing," Cecily said very quietly. "It was," he said. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair on the other side of the desk, which he had never done, and he folded his hands, and he said nothing for a time, and she let the silence sit between them because it was not an empty silence, it was full of something that had just arrived. She was aware of the firelight on his hands, the particular steadiness of his posture, the fact that for the first time in 23 days he had nothing in his hands to occupy them. No letter, no document. He had come in here with nothing but the intention of being here, and the understanding of what that meant moved through her very quietly, in the way that certain things move through one when there has been no warning and no rehearsal. She did not look away from the inventory. I owe you an apology, he said at last, for 11 words in 23 days. She felt her composure do something it was not accustomed to doing, which was to soften. You owe me nothing, she said. You owed me a fire, which you provided. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was not control or grief or discipline. It was something quieter than all of those things, something that had not yet decided what to call itself. There is a matter, he said slowly, of the brooch, which is technically a piece of evidence and which Mr. Potts informs me this morning he is prepared to attest to in any proceeding that may become necessary. Mr. Potts, she said, is thorough, a quality I should attend to more consistently. He looked at the brooch, still on her shoulder. She had not removed it. She had put on the green gown again because it was the warmest of the 3 gowns she had brought, and the brooch was still pinned where it had been. He looked at it for a moment. I would like to make a proposal, he said. Regarding the brooch, she waited. I would like you to keep it, he said. Not as found property. Not as evidence. A token of regard, if you will allow it. He stopped. Something in him was very careful, the way a man is careful when he has only just learned to speak again, after a long silence, as a token of my particular esteem. For a woman of very decided intelligence who wore someone else's accusation to dinner and sat quietly while it detonated. Cecily looked at the brooch, the dark garnets catching the firelight, the seed pearls pale against the silver mount. That is not, she said, a conventional offer. No, he said. I am not, I think, a conventional man. A pause, and then he said something she had not expected, in a voice she had not heard from him before. It was her name in his voice, for the first time, and it landed in the room with the weight of a thing decided. She looked up at him. Will you allow me, he said, to make a more conventional offer in time? When I have demonstrated rather more than 11 words of acquaintance, she felt her mouth do what it rarely did, which was to curve. You have demonstrated rather more than that, she said. You have demonstrated a fire, and a memorandum, and a set of Mr. Hobbs's notes read 3 weeks too late. She paused. And you have demonstrated that you knew, before I told the table anything, that I had not taken it. A silence. I knew, he said. Yes, she said. I thought you did. Outside the study window, the November grounds of Dunmore House lay under a thin frost that caught the morning light and held it pale and still, and the bare trees stood in their rows in the attitude of things that have waited out worse seasons than this one and know they will stand to see the spring. The fire crackled once and settled. Cicely picked up her pen and opened the inventory to the page she had left, and the Earl did not move from the chair across the desk, and the morning came into the room through the tall window and fell across them both, even in its distribution, and the brooch at her shoulder was warm at last. By Christmas the enquiry Mr. Potts had attended to was resolved, the allegation in Bath amended in the records to what it had been from the first. Baseless. Lady Harwick had departed the county and taken her connections elsewhere, which left a particular vacancy in the dowager's social arrangements that she addressed, with characteristic practicality, by beginning to regard Cecily's presence in the household with something that was not warmth, but was in the vicinity of it, and growing closer. On the afternoon of the winter solstice, Cecily came in from the garden, where she had been walking with Mrs. Graves, the steward's wife, and found the Earl standing in the entrance hall with a small paper-wrapped package in his hand, and he held it out to her, and she opened it. Inside, on a card in his handwriting, were the words, "For Cecily, already mine." Beneath the card was the garnet and pearl brooch, which she had returned to him in October so that it might be restored to its owner, and which had apparently found its way to a jeweler in London and returned. The silver mount newly polished, the garnets bright. She looked up at him. I wrote a great many letters in November, he said, and you corrected my correspondence for 3 weeks. So you know my hand. I will not pretend to eloquence. A pause. I should like you to have it. I should like you to have the east wing as well, and the library, and the particular quality of light in the study in the morning. I should like you to have whatever you choose to make of this house. Another pause, and then very quietly, "I should like you to have me." She stood in the entrance hall of Dunmore House with the brooch in her palm and the card in her other hand, and she looked at him, and she said, "I accept." It was not a grand speech. It was 4 words, and it was precisely the right number of words, and they were the most consequential 4 words she had spoken in 24 years. That evening she wrote to her father's solicitor and to one old friend and to no one else. And then she went to the study, where the fire was burning, and she sat at the desk with a cup of tea that Mrs. Graves had sent up without being asked. Which was the housekeeper's own form of congratulation, Cecily thought. And she pinned the brooch to the left shoulder of her dark green gown one more time, and she opened the December inventory, and she worked until the candles burned low. She was nearly through the final column when the door opened. And he came in. He did not say anything. He sat in his chair on the other side of the desk, and he took a book from the side table, a volume of botanical correspondence she had reorganized 3 weeks ago and placed within his reach without comment, and he opened it, and he read. They worked in silence for an hour. The fire crackled once. Outside the study window the snow had stopped, and the grounds lay white and still under the winter stars, and the house was quiet around them with the particular quiet of a place that has come, over 23 days of small, careful acts, to feel like a home. The brooch was warm against her shoulder. It had been warm since he put it in her hand. Outside the study window, the first snow of the winter was falling on the frost-white grounds of Dunmore House, falling on the bare trees and the gray stone walls and the long avenue that led to the road to the county town, falling with the unhurried certainty of things that have been a long time arriving and intend to stay. Inside, the fire crackled once. It stayed. If this story stayed with you, leave your favorite moment in the comments. Thank you for sitting at this table with Cecily until the last course was cleared.